Hello and welcome to the Boundless Book Club, the bi-weekly podcast for the Emirates Literature Foundation. You are here with
Annabelle,
Andrea,
and me, Ahlam. Our guest today is Saeed Saeed, arts and culture features writer for The National. The last time Saeed joined us on the podcast to talk about regional authors, we had such a great response from you, our listeners. We had lots of comments and people sharing the episodes, and we loved that. Please keep your comments coming on social media or email us on comms@emiratesfest.com. And today we'll be talking about the Oscars of the book world and the 6 talented authors whose books have made it to the shortlist. And before we get into the books themselves, I wanted to ask you all a question. Do you rate the Booker Prize? It is one of the most prestigious prizes in the English-speaking world, but does it mean anything to you? Or is there another prize you trust more?
I think when it comes to book awards generally, we kind of have to distinguish, between what kind of people are following it, right? So, you get the sort of Booker Award, for example, is followed, to a T by the publishing industry, as journalists, as culture lovers, because, you get, forget winning the Booker Award. If you get the Booker stamp, a nomination, that's a whole marketing campaign. Right there. So that shifts thousands of books. So within the industry, it's a very, very important book. And it's also a great way to kind of give, certain authors a spotlight that we don't know, because, the Bookers isn't a popularity contest. It's about the craft, right? So you find a lot of authors internationally getting the spotlight suddenly, globally, from the Booker Awards. So in that sense, it's very important. Now, as a reader speaking, I think book awards generally don't mean that you'll buy the book, but book awards generally, I think what they do is they're a good guide on books to read in the future. So I think on that sense, book awards, they serve different purposes to different people.
Agree with that as well. One thing that comes to mind is actually a conversation that we had about one of the books that I think you'll be talking about today, Ahlam. I'm not going to go into detail about the book, but we had a book club conversation about it this week, and I have to say that the Booker books tend to make for excellent dissection afterwards. So whatever the experience of reading the book has been, I find that it's always a rich conversation afterwards. And so it's almost like the Booker Prize doesn't just feel like a book award for adding stuff to your library. It's it gives you discussion fodder. And I always think that they're kind of like water cooler prompts more than they are just books in themselves. They're part of like a wider cultural conversation. I think that's what I like the most about the Booker Prize. And I don't think I've ever had a year where I've read something on the Booker shortlist and I've not thought about it in more detail or had an argument with someone about it. So it's always been fun, and then there's always a lot of controversy as well on some years, which again all adds to the discussion, all adds to the conversation. So that's what I like about the Booker Prize. It's never dull. It's sometimes dull reading the books, but it's not necessarily dull talking about them.
How true. I find that I really like the Women's Prize for Fiction for I think their shortlist is usually really, really great in a slightly more readable way than the Booker Prize. I think the Booker shortlist and longlist is it's quite a big mix of things, which I love, but they tend to be slightly less readable for the masses, I think, whereas the Women's Prize seem to factor that in a bit more.
Yeah,
in the same way that I think the movies that are nominated for the Oscars, are not necessarily for everyone. They're, have a specific criteria to be on that list, and maybe not as digestible for the masses too.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, I guess, similar to, the Oscars and the Grammy Awards, there's a lot of things that happen behind the Booker Awards. And there's a lot of jockeying, there's a lot of lobbying, especially, from big, powerful publishing firms, right? So it's not, it's not a very kind of pure view of everybody sitting there in the table and talking. There's a lot of stuff. It's a whole campaign to get nominated. Then it's a whole campaign to actually win it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think this year, one of my favorite Booker-related stories is how William Sutcliffe, who's married to Maggie O'Farrell, went onto Twitter after the announcement of the long list and said, "I do not know a single thing more that you could do that my wife hasn't done that should get you on the long list for this prize." And I just think that's romance. He was like taking to Twitter for his wife after the fact. And it was adorable.
But it's true though. I mean, to think about even, with Avni Doshi, whose book I'm going to be talking about later, to think that initially there were so many publishers who didn't want to publish her, and then now suddenly she's gotten to this place and Burnt Sugar is on the short list and now she's blown up. Just makes you think how many writers out there who are just like writing genius pieces of work that go unnoticed and not picked up just because they don't have the right marketing campaign, like you say, Saeed, or they don't have the right push to get them to where they need to be.
It's great when it happens to an unknown and they have that Pretty Woman moment where, the publishers turn them down, and now she's shortlisted for the Booker Prize and she can walk in and say, big mistake, huge. And I love those stories, and it just, I think that's the nice side of the Booker Prize.
I think it's pretty amazing if you write a book that is due to be published and the Booker Prize changes the day of its award ceremony because they don't want to clash with your book launch, which is what happened with Obama's memoir, which I think is that is pretty insane. He might not win the Booker, but he's kind of won the whole game anyway.
That's it. That he knows he's won the whole publishing industry.
He's won at life.
Prize for him. Yeah. Okay, so we've got 6 shortlisted books for this Booker Prize, and before we talk about who we think will win, which I don't want to get ahead of myself. So what have we all brought to discuss today? I know you mentioned Avni Doshi, so maybe we start with Avni there, with you, Ahlam.
Yeah, I mean, what's really exciting about this is that Avni is based right here in our hometown in Dubai, and it's not often that we have someone from our hometown be nominated in this way for such a global award. So it was really, really exciting when she got nominated. We were all celebrating in the office, and what was really cool was that I got to read the book and then interview her a week after at the Arts Club. And so once I had finished the book, I actually picked up the phone and had a conversation with her. And I had the most incredible conversation before the session. And I was thinking, I really wish we didn't have this conversation so it could have happened on stage in front of a live audience, because it was such a great conversation. But then we went on stage and we had a completely different discussion altogether. There's just so much to say about the story. So it's a story of a woman named Antara, who was raised by her mother and has had a very difficult upbringing with her mother. Her mother's made lots of maybe selfish choices that made Antara's life particularly difficult, with part of the time living in an ashram where her mother took her away from her father and moved into this ashram with her, and had a relationship with the guru, a romantic relationship with the guru while they were there. So the Antara was very much detached from her throughout the time in the ashram. And then they move on to having Antara in a boarding school where life was super, super difficult for her over there as well. And just throughout her life and until she grows up, her relationship with her mother is difficult. Her mother is not always aware or kind to her in the way that, you know, Antara wanted or deserved. And now her mother is getting Alzheimer's and forgetting her memory, and Antara is left with taking care of someone who never really took care of her when she needed her, you know, all of her life. And so she, you know, she starts off the book saying, you know, I'd be lying if I said watching my mom, you know, my mom suffer wasn't giving me pleasure. But, you know, now it's like she's going into this situation, and it's like anyone would have told me, you know, that's enough now. Situations are different. And it's really interesting, you know, and in the book, Antara is an artist as well, and she's creating this art piece which is closely linked to memory, where every single day she paints this portrait of a man and then puts it away, and then the next day draws exactly the same thing, and she keeps on going for a couple of years, and then sort of looking at what you end up with in the end and what your first drawing was, and kind of that reflecting memory in the same way, how it like changes just a little bit with every passing day, which is really, really interesting. But the writing style of Avni is so concise, so compact and powerful. She says a lot in a few words and short sentences, and I love that writing style. I learned a lot about difficult relationships throughout the book. You know, even though it's fiction, there's always a lot of truth to it. You know, her relationship with her husband, her relationship with her mother, with her father, and you know, her willingness to accept love because of the difficulty of her youth, and also it's all about motherhood, and also postpartum depression. And so there's a lot of interesting themes in the book. Really recommend it. It's not a long read as well. You could probably read it in a day or two, depending on how fast you are, but like it's really gripping. I found myself just thinking about the characters throughout the couple of days that I was reading the book, and being really concerned with them. If you're interested in watching an interview with Avni, Annabelle and I have spoken to her on the podcast, and there's an episode on our channel, so check that out for sure. I loved the book, and I think it was my favorite read since January.
What
I'd really like to hear about Saeed's book, because that was one I was really interested in reading as well, and I think I will after this.
Sure. And so the book that I'm coming with is The Shadow King, right over here for you, by Mazaa Mengiste, Ethiopian American writer. This book was really it was anticipated. And that's because, you know, that's because her first book was the wonderful debut, Beneath the Lion's Gaze. That book was that year ended up on top of many lists in terms of the critical appreciation, listed also in a number of publications as as one of the best African novels from the decade. So since then, you know, we didn't hear much from her. You know, and that's because, you know, she has been working in the States, teaching creative writing across various institutions. So her new book, The Shadow King, in a way picks up, it's kind of in a way, it's almost like a prologue to Beneath the Lion's Gaze. And you're seeing this as well with Mazaa Mengiste's work throughout the years, her short stories and everything. She writes very, very close to home. So where Beneath the Lion's Gaze was very similar to her story, which is of a family struggling to survive, you know, in the years of the Ethiopian Revolution in the 1970s. The Shadow King picks up basically just on the cusp of that revolution beginning, and the story looks back, you know, into 30, 40 years. So the actual book itself is set in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, which basically occurred from 1935 to 1937. It was basically a defense against Italy's imperial ambitions. And this was one of the minor battles that was a precursor for World War II. So we're just setting you up here with the situation. And basically, the Shadow King tells the story of a young woman. Her name is Hirut. She's a young woman who was a servant and who worked in a house because of her parents died. And the book, over a 40-year span, traces her journey from being this kind of lowly servant, not ambitious, to being essentially one of a warrior, within that struggle. And and I think what this book does, it really sheds light on the many Ethiopian women who were the backbone, of that battle, for Ethiopia to successfully, keep, to keep its territorial integrity. So that's essentially kind of the outsider of the book. But the book basically, in itself, is basically about relationships. So the thing is, the book begins essentially with her entering, this large house, and it's almost like a Ethiopian Downton Abbey situation, So she's there as the servant, and and she's basically brought into the house as a favor from her dead mother to Kidane, who runs the household, who's also a leader in the battlefield. And the first part of the book essentially kind of exposes, I guess, the societal configuration of Ethiopian society at the time, which is essentially it was very feudalistic. It was very kind of your place. So she was there as the servant. Then then there's the chef. There's the housekeeper. So within that relationship, there's also issues. And then you have Esther, who feels a little bit threatened, by Hirut, her young age, and what does that mean for her. So the first part of the book essentially kind of looks at that relationship, and then as the drums of war kind of louder and louder, they all go out basically in the open. The men have gone to fight the war, and the women are kind of following behind and getting engaged, in their own battles. And within those battles as well, enmities between the people in that household kind of doesn't mean anything. There's forgiveness, there's anger. Each relationship really swings from fury to love, from anger to forgiveness. And so there's a lot kind of going on there. And that's the really interesting thing about Mengiste's writing, is that she's juggling so many things, and and the book is narrated, through the eyes of Hirut, who also transforms, again, from this kind of very meek, shy person, to this battle-hardened kind of warrior woman, So Mengiste kind of tackles this in a very meditative and kind of a somber way, but at the same time, the book is relatively pacey because there's battles going on as well. So it's not really an action thing, or like an action or war tale in any way. It was kind of more about how war is used to kind of expose, truths about yourself, and how you kind of relate, to the world. So it's a very interesting book. I finished it 2-3 days ago, and even now, just talking about it, there's still a lot of things that I'm trying to unpack, because there's a lot of layers in this. And the book has been rightfully hailed, as one of the best, of the year. And in a way, this is definitely if the Booker Award had a genre, this is definitely within the Booker wheelhouse. The Booker wheelhouse is it's evocative. It smacks of of culture. Inspiring women. And yeah, it's definitely. I'm not surprised that it's within this nominated.
You say that, but I have to say that is one of the few books on the shortlist that I wanted to read from the blurb on the back. And if I think back to books, I never pick them up because they sound interesting on the back.
Some of them really do. That's unfair.
I think the Testaments did. Well, but
I loved Milkman. I think that was exactly.
But it's one of those things though that it's great when you read it, but I just think that I always feel sorry for whoever has to market them sometimes, market literary fiction, because often so much happens in terms of like the emotional progress of the characters and relationships, and there's so much going on, but it's not necessarily kind of action plot based stuff.
Yeah.
You know, that they're not plot novels, which is why if you try and discuss like a murder mystery in a book club, like the conversation isn't going to last that long. But with a book, it does. Like you said, Saeed, you're still having stuff to unpack. But honestly, when I think it's maybe just me, but when I read the back of the booker list, I tend to not do that because none of them really appeal that much until you actually start reading them and you're like, wow, this is great.
It's funny you say that because I think the book you read, Annabelle, absolutely had the type of blurb that would make you go, "Ooh, this is going to be interesting."
No,
you don't think
so? Why'd you pick it for today?
Okay, because I thought because Saeed picked The Shadow King.
My process of elimination.
And so I think it was also because in our travel episode, we talked about kind of wildernesses and stuff. So essentially, The New Wilderness by Diane Cook is set in a near future where climate change and overpopulation has taken hold. So human beings have nowhere else to go except overbuilt city dwellings, as all land is now used for resources, oil, gas, water, food, storage, etc. So there's one area of wilderness that's left, and it's called, quite fittingly, the wilderness state. There's one patch of land, no human is allowed to enter for obvious reasons. They're trying to preserve it. And what's interesting about this is it wasn't written with kind of COVID or current climate change in mind. Diane actually wrote it, I think, a few years ago. But as with any kind of timely novel, it's, you know, happenstance. So it's been published now and everyone's calling it quite timely. When you approach this novel, all of these dystopian elements are already part of humanity's new normal. And everyone, essentially, because of overpopulation and pollution, and then being nowhere else to go, they're all crammed in the city with a capital C. And it's just this smog-filled, dense, packed society. Trees are few and far between. I think there's something like 12 in the city, and they're kind of barricaded off. Now, from the description that I've just given you and what's kind of on the back of the book, it leans very heavy into the dystopia. And I think we've had cli-fi before. So I think when I read the back of the book, it wasn't necessarily that I thought that it sounded uninteresting, because actually, you're right, it does sound like one of the more interesting ones on there. But it wasn't necessarily something that I wanted to read, because I thought, okay, there are other books that tackle this. This doesn't sound like it's necessarily for me, but the wilderness angle of it really appealed to me because of our travel episode. And the moment I read the first paragraph, I thought, okay, I should have just read the first paragraph and not the back of the book. You kind of like learn the background I just told you over the course of the first chapter, but it's woven into the present day of a group of 20 people, or they start as a group of 20 people, which gradually gets whittled down, who are sent into this wilderness state as an experiment to see, because for years and years, human beings have not been exposed to nature, what that relationship between nature and human beings would look like. So they basically go in as guinea pigs, and to see whether or not human beings can still coexist with nature in any productive, kind of peaceful way. So this community of people, as they try and inhabit this wilderness state, and they can't just kind of be left to their own devices. They have this kind of nomadic hunter-gatherer existence. So it's set in the future, but there's also this kind of harkening back to primitive life, which I think is really, really interesting part of the story. And there's kind of this bit that I wanted to read to you here. There's this observation that the main character makes. She says, there used to be a cultural belief in an era before she was born that having close ties to nature made one a better person. And when they first arrived in the wilderness, they imagined living there might make them more sympathetic, better, more attuned people. But they came to understand there being great misunderstanding about what better actually meant. It's possible it simply meant better at being human, and left the definition of the word human up for interpretation. It might have only meant better at surviving anywhere, by any means. So I think you can tell from that though they moved to this wilderness state, it's not smooth sailing. They have to fend for themselves. People in the group die. And it's quite a harsh existence. They have what they're called rangers, who give them a very strict set of rules and check in on them, some more sternly than others. There is an unnerving sense of, what is this experiment actually for, and who's behind it and who's controlling it? And you can see the group dynamic disintegrate as well, as you might expect, not necessarily in a Lord of the Flies kind of way, but gradually you can see certain members of the group undermining others, and there's like a play for leadership and power that you might expect from this sort of situation. And amongst all of that, the highlight of this, and it made me think of Avni Doshi's book actually in terms of style and subject matter, weirdly, even though it's this dystopian novel with a really great plot. The mother-daughter relationship is the heart and soul of this book. So Agnes and Bea. Now, if you imagine this young girl has been brought to this wilderness when she's 5 years old, and when she's kind of 8, and that's when you meet her, she's this feral being that's really at home in her surroundings. And she's becoming more and more attuned with nature, while her mother still kind of misses things about the city and things about her past and her old job. And they kind of butt heads on this. And there's this great quote that I'll end with from the author on kind of that whole relationship. And she says, I wanted to write about the ways we lose important people in our lives, not just in death, but in the ways we don't connect even when we want to. I think of Bea and Agnes as magnets, as likely to be brought together as they are to be repelled apart. I think that is so common in relationships between mothers and daughters. It is such an elemental bond. It can feel so charged, feel so loving, and then hurt so much. And I think Ahlam, reading Avni's book, I think that's something that you feel in that as well.
Mm. Yeah, as difficult as the relationship is, they're connected in such a deep way.
Yeah.
That, whether you like it or not, it just is.
Annabelle, I'm just wondering, when it comes, going back to the conversation about, looking at book blurbs, because and this leads to this book, right? The thing is, a lot of the time when I'm looking at book blurbs, I'm almost scanning it for certain words, because certain words for me, I'm like, nope, that's not it. So for me, some of the words are farm. I don't read anything. I don't do books set in farms. I'm sorry. Okay, and
oddly specific.
I know. And another one is environment, and like that type of situation that you described. And a lot of it is because I don't feel I have the patience, because I associate those books set in in desolate or quite static environments as I'll be subjected to pages and pages of description, and I'll fall asleep. And because I don't have that that literary patience to kind of go that. So in your book, when the author describes the desolate nature and the environment, is it done like with a light touch, or is it quite heavy going?
I think it's quite lightly done, and I think that there is a lot of care in it. So I remember when there was a moment where she's describing the landscape, and just the words she used just to describe kind of the craggy mountains and everything, it felt like there was action taking place in the landscape, but she does a very good job of capturing the wildness of the place and how inhospitable it can be. but then also kind of those pockets of comfort. So I thought it was quite lightly done, but what I would recommend you don't do is do what I did and go to Goodreads and read what other people have said about it. I realized I liked this book quite a lot when I got very angry on its behalf when I read Goodreads reviews. And there was one lengthy one that was kind of like an essay on, this didn't make sense, this didn't make sense. The description was endless. And I didn't feel that way at all. But you'll know from the first like 3 pages, Saeed, if it's for you or not.
I understand.
Yeah. But don't go on Goodreads, honestly.
I think that goes for everything. Just don't go on Goodreads.
I'm feeling like that more and more now.
Yeah. But I'm interested in this. What are the other key words that you avoid?
Yeah.
Knights and Templars. I don't do that either. Yeah, I mean, because it's funny because like these are just like I don't know how it even came, but I just kind of feel that books that are kind of so far. I think it's actually more personal because all of this stuff is so far removed from where I grew up in. So for me, making that imaginative leap to even to kind of render the image in my mind, I find it very hard.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so when I see things like terrain, mountains, rivers, and oceans, like for example, for me, one of the biggest writers in Australia, as someone who comes from Australia, is Tim Winton. He's I mean, from what I understand, Tim Winton is an amazing author. He won basically everything, but every book he has is about the ocean, and I can't deal with that.
I want to pick that up right now.
It's very water heavy. So it's funny, how that works.
While we're on the subject, I was just going to ask, like, what are your trigger words? Like, what are the words that you see and that you run a mile with?
I was just going to say Annabelle's is manifestation. I know hers, but I'm not sure what mine is.
But do you remember a long time ago, we did an episode where we said the classics that we are not going to read? I don't remember where yours were, but mine is Moby Dick. And if I see Mariner on the back of a boat, then I'm out. The word mariner just never leads to anything good.
Yeah, I'm not sure what specific words I'm like repelled by, but I'm often attracted to books about complicated relationships. I don't know, like that's my like immediate draw.
Yeah.
So the Booker Prize is great for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to read everything you guys have talked about today. So,
but Andrea, what's your book?
Okay, so
where are you taking us?
I am taking you to post-revolution Zimbabwe.
Oh wow!
So I read this.
I like that already. Post-revolution. I'm down. Okay.
Yeah. I think there's definitely some parallels between our books, Saeed, because So I've read This Mournable Body by Tsitsi Dangarembga. Sorry, I'm butchering that. I'm sorry, Tsitsi. She's a Zimbabwean writer who's very, very highly acclaimed. And there's the parallels with sort of the post-imperialism and the women who've gone to war. But this is the third book in a sort of very loosely connected trilogy. And having not read the earlier two, I think means that I don't get as much of the sort of the women who came back from war story. It's been called quite a difficult book to read, and it is, but it's also rewarding, and it tells you a bit about Zimbabwe's independence, but through this woman who's from just a normal village. Her name's Tambu, or Tambudzai, and she's a really difficult character to like. She's She's damaged, but because of the way these novels are written, if you only come to the third book, then you don't actually know the source of that damage, and you don't know where all these issues that she clearly has, where what they stem from. She is really difficult to like and really difficult to root for. And when we first meet her, we know that she's left a job, a highly paid, prestigious job at an advertising agency, which she's left for some reason that we don't know. But we get the sense that it's connected to a sense of pride. And she's living in this hostel for young women, but she's too old to be there. And the lady, very kindly, the kind lady who runs it, keeps sort of saying, you know, do you think you could possibly move out soon? And there's this really horrible passage early on in the book where we get the sense of who Tambu is, which I just wanted to mention, where she's at the market and she's waiting to get on this bus to go back to where she lives, to the hostel. And she sees this woman who lives in the same hostel, who's this beautiful young woman who's also going to get a bus, who's dressed in a fairly short dress. But the people at the market take an issue with her being this beautiful woman in a short dress. So they start harassing her. And Tambu gets completely caught up in this. And someone is sort of pulling at this woman's dress, and Tambu's sort of titillated by it and looking, and the crowd ripples and fidgets and hums and buzzes with amusement, and energy swirls out from this mirth, and it slides you from your seat to the ground and into the throng. The crowd laughs, and you do too, and as you do, you grow and grow until you believe you're much bigger than yourself, and this is wonderful. And then it just carries on, and the menace of this crowd just grows, and it's written in second person, which is really unusual. So it's you are there, and you suddenly have a stone in your hand, and people are pushing and sort of calling this woman names, and you're really enjoying this. And that is a really horrible scene. It's so full of menace. And you really get a sense of this woman just not being a very nice person at all. And she knows this woman who's being harassed. So that's sort of what we know of her. And she has so much pride, which, as we know, comes before a mighty fall. And she's a terrible hypocrite. And at every point where we think that she is going to pull herself together and sort of get herself sorted, and you know, get a job or move out of the hostel, or whatever it might be, she comes so close, and then it just comes crumbling down. And it's a difficult book because there's so much humanity, and there's so many ugly human traits that you recognize, but they've just been blown out of proportion. So at some point we get the sense that she must have been told that she's destined for greatness because she was really good in school and so on, because she has all that bitterness of unfulfilled promises. And she's just incapable of dealing with what her life has actually become. So we see her deteriorate mentally, physically. And it's a bit of a slog, because you are her. It's in the second person, so it's all you are doing all these horrible things, you are experiencing all this trauma.
So do you feel like you're being dragged down with her?
You are dragged down with her. You're doing some pretty bad things at points as well. You're losing control of yourself, but that also means that when it turns, it's really rewarding. It's a hard-going book, but it is also really rewarding. And when you get to the end of it, you feel like you've deserved to get to the end of it. And it's it tells you quite a lot of things that you probably wouldn't ever know about Zimbabwe and what it's like to be there and to be in that what's left after the revolution, after the war, after the women came back from war with all their difficulties that they brought back. So it's really great. Really great.
I mean, the author's having the experience of present day Zimbabwe right now, sadly.
Yes, I know. I mean, those sorts of things shouldn't have an impact on the outcome of a literary competition, but I do feel like there is potential for that to become a factor.
Yeah, and I wonder, do you know if there's been any development on that, or has it just gone completely quiet?
I think she's still not free.
Oh, okay.
As far as I know.
Yeah.
But she's a super impressive woman, the author of this book. She's founded a film festival, I believe, in Zimbabwe, and she's written 3 books that have all had great acclaim, and she's just like a proper mover and shaker.
Wow.
I was trying to, there was something that you said there about humanity, and you said something really, really eloquent and poignant, and I can't remember. But
that it exposes you to all the ugly parts of humanity that are just out of proportion, but we all have some of it.
Yeah,
it's like the ugliest parts of ourselves.
I'm loving all of the different connections between our different. They're all very, very different books, and I know there are only like 4 of the 6 on the shortlist, but there's definitely that sense in The New Wilderness as this whole kind of theme of what is humanity. I think you heard from the extract that I read as well, and kind of what that actually means. And you know, I mean, Rutger Bregman would argue that actually, no, left to our own devices, we are decent, kind, lovely human beings. But kind of as a thought experiment, The New Wilderness is a really interesting one.
Yeah, that's the one I want to read next. Actually, it's really
it's great.
The author, debut author as well.
No. I think Diane Cook has written another book with similar themes before. She's written a book called Man versus Nature. So she said that this is kind of an overspill of all of the things that she's been thinking of. And again, it was one that took a really long time to write as well. So she started in 2012 and just kind of been returning to it since. So aspiring writers, have hope, persevere.
Yes.
But do we know anything about the ones that we haven't read for the podcast, and who do you think is going to win from what you know of the other 2 and what you've heard today?
So I think Shuggie Bain, which is one of the ones none of us have read for today. It seems very, very gritty. It's sort of set it's a family drama in Glasgow, I believe, in a very poor circumstances. And I started reading sort of the first chapter of that. And I sense that's going to be a bit of a misery fest, possibly in the most beautiful way. But I think it's got potential to be a winner. I'd rather mind it.
I mean, the Shadow King, the Shadow King, there is just following its progress from reading the book. After there is a lot of there is a lot of chatter about this. I mean, there's Mazaa as well has this kind of Chimamanda grace to it as well, so you kind of see as well, while it's always about the quality of the book as well, in terms of in terms of this book has a lot of potential in crossing over, like the way Chimamanda Adichie's books do. So so in a way, because the story, while it does span, there's a lot of elements to it, politics, history. It is actually written it's relatively accessible, in comparison to you know, to the other books here that we just mentioned. I mean, I'm sure Avni Doshi's book is relatively accessible as well. But in comparison to from what I get from Diane Cook's book and Tsitsi's book, The Shadow King can kind of break through, I think, and get a wider readership.
Interestingly, Chimamanda, I think we all agree, is one of the most amazing people. I'm just assuming that we all agree on that because of course she is. But she's never been nominated for the Booker, has she?
I wonder.
Chimamanda?
Yeah.
Hasn't?
Well, I don't think so. Maybe longlisted.
Been on
I
the
love that
Women's
you're
Prize,
asking
right?
this because it's been on my mind since the Nobel Prize was announced, and there was that whole like always the bridesmaid, never the bride story resurfacing about Haruki Murakami and all his sad
I'm
fans.
so delighted to know that I'm a Harukist. Is that what I am?
Yeah.
To Sheikh Google, which led me to a story by The Guardian. Chimamanda's first novel was longlisted for the Man Booker. So that was a long list.
Was that Purple Hibiscus?
The first book. Yeah, that's right. I think because the follow-up of that was the follow-up was The Half of a Yellow Sun. Right.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. I almost kind of feel that the Man Booker is almost, again, it's like it's his own kind of, it exists in its own kind of universe. Like, you know, I don't think I don't think you know, we used examples of the Oscars, right? You know, like normally a lot of the time the Oscars, you know, most of the time the award kind of confirms what we already know, right? While this one is just almost kind of like its own field. You know, so in a way, well, you know, where Chimamanda, you know, doesn't even exist in that universe, I think, for example. So it's interesting how it works out.
Also, absolutely. I mean, something that we haven't mentioned about the Booker Prize is that the judging panel changes every year. So, I mean, it's not that they don't vary them every single year, but I looked at the judges for this year and I thought, okay, Margaret Busby, Lee Child, Mengiste, Samir Rahim, Emily Wilson. And if you look at the biographies of each of these people as well, I think it makes sense that we've got I think we've got a really good list this year. What do you think?
Yeah. It's an unusual list this year.
It does reflect the judging panel's palette. You know, as well. Like, not like in a personal way of this is what I like to read, but basically how they kind of view literature. You know, the prism, because I mean, like, you know, Lemon Cisse, who is a guest of the Literature Festival so many times, you know, he's always been one to champion works, you know, from Africa. You know, he always loved works, you know, that blended, you know, history, like his work blended history, poetry, and fiction. You know, so in a way, like books like The Shadow King definitely makes sense within the context of Lemon Cisse being there.
Yeah. I was also thinking about the long list and kind of any books that didn't make it and whether you were sad about that or it made sense. And I think there was one that you mentioned, Andrea. Was it Such a Fun Age? Like, it's a great book, but you were surprised that it was on the list.
It didn't feel like a Booker long list book at all to me. But it was great. I loved it. It just didn't seem like something that would normally make it onto the list.
Yeah. And there was, you said, Saeed, that it reflects the palette of the judging panel as well. And I remember there was a year that I think it was the year Val McDermid crime writer, was on the judging panel, but that great crime novel Snap by Belinda Bauer ended up on the long list. Never made it to the shortlist, but it feels sometimes like there are these writers of genre fiction that end up on judging panels that at least manage to kind of push a genre novel onto the long list. They don't make it to the short list, but they get pushed to a wider audience, which is lovely.
And particularly crime fiction. Like, crime fiction authors are a very kind of cliquey bunch. Crime fiction authors always kind of. I remember at the Emirates Literature Book Festival, we interviewed Mark Billingham, and Mark Billingham, he was telling me how crime authors kind of always kind of band together, to kind of show, literature that, so-called the literature, literary authors, that what they do matter. So I do kind of feel maybe Val, so you know what, this is one for the team. It's a long list for you right here.
What do you guys think about that? I get where it comes from.
Should we say anything else? Should we do our guesses? Who do you think is going to win? Ahlam?
I'm rooting for Avni.
Saeed?
Honestly, I think if I was the Booker Award in terms of marketing, in terms of getting the attention, you would not go bad with the Shadow King.
Annabelle?
I don't know. I think Shuggie might, but Shuggie, Shuggie, Tsitsi, or Avni. So 3. I've narrowed it down to 3. I don't know.
Yeah, that's 50%.
Yeah.
That's equivalent of just kind of going.
Well, I'm going to phone a friend. Andrea, what do you think?
I feel like Shuggie's got things going for it as an award.
I love that
type of.
Shuggie has things going for it.
I'm going to go with Tsitsi. I love Tsitsi. This Mournable body. It was difficult, and difficult books need a bit of an extra hand to get out there. So even if
Interesting that 2 of you have said Shuggie, but none of us read it for today's episode.
It just feels like a book.
Yeah. But maybe it feels like a Booker book of the past.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm undecided.
So not necessarily for this year.
I'd be happy if the New Wilderness won, but I don't think it will. I'd like to be proved wrong. Did we win anything for guessing correctly?
Yes, you will win. You will win.
Oh, what is it?
This wonderful Halloween spider.
Halloween leftovers. Amazing.
Right, that's all for today. We would love to know what you think. Who will win it, and will they deserve to win it? Is it all political correctness gone mad? It never is, by the way. Pop us a message on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and you can find us at ELF Dubai, that's ELF Dubai, or Emirates Lit Fest. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a 5-star rating, as it helps others like you find our podcast. Thanks again, Saeed, for joining us today. Until next time, take care. Stay tuned for the big announcement on the 19th of November. Remember, the 19th of November, we will find out who the winner is.
Woo!
That's all.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.